Hi everybody, thank you for joining me as I continue to examine N.T. Wright's Simply Christian from my atheist perspective. In this video I'm going to cover chapters 3 and 4 of the book, which will complete part 1 of the book, which collectively is titled Echoes of a Voice. So let's go ahead and get started with chapter 3, which is titled Made for Each Other. Wright opens this chapter by describing how many young married couples begin their relationships adoring each other, only to see their relationships eventually degenerate into conflict and divorce. And Wright asks, isn't there something odd about this? As when Wright asked the same question about our occasional failures to live up to our own moral standards in chapter 1, I have to say no. Not really. I mean, Wright wonders why relationships are so difficult if our love and our desire for each other is so strong. I don't see how anyone with any experience interacting with other people on any level could seriously ask that question. Of course, Wright isn't asking it seriously. He's just stacking building blocks for his premise in this chapter. He's doing the same thing that he's done up to this point in the book so far, which is to make incredibly difficult questions that actually aren't that difficult to answer. But I'll talk more about that as we go along here. His premise for this chapter is that our longing to form relationships with each other is another one of those echoes of a voice. It's another sign, a part of our human experience that points to something beyond ourselves, to something greater that we are hearing echoes of and trying to reach and connect with. This would be then along with our longing for justice and spirituality. It would be indirect evidence for God. Wright says, quote, "We all know that justice matters, yet it slips through our fingers. We mostly know there is such a thing as spirituality and that it's important, yet it's hard to refute the charge that it's all wishful thinking. In the same way, we all know that we belong in communities, that we're made to be social creatures. We all know we belong in relationships, but we can't quite work out how to get them right. The voice we hear echoing in our heads and our hearts keeps reminding us of this paradox, and it's worth pondering why." It's also worth remembering that the voice in our heads Wright is referring to is a rhetorical device that he is using to refer to several different things at once, including our private thoughts, our instincts and impulses, social pressures, and our perceptions of the interests and expectations of other people. As in the first 2 chapters, Wright will suggest that this voice is calling to us from on high, that it is our echo of the voice of God that we're hearing. But the voice, or rather the various things being referred to by that term, can be explained much better, I think, without the assumption that Jesus is whispering to our hearts, or whatever it is that Wright believes is going on. Wright notes that even though solitude can be desirable, sometimes most of us don't want to be alone all the time. Most of us don't desire permanent or even long-lasting separation from other people. And even most people who are naturally solitary or introverted, will at least be able to recognize that this is unusual, that most people don't want this sort of thing. It's not typical human behavior. We humans define ourselves in the context of society. We define ourselves and who we are as individuals by relating ourselves to other people. We find purpose that way. We find purpose not just in ourselves, but in how we interact with each other. No argument there for me. Wright then takes a few pages to describe the variety of human communities at various scales, all the way up to the nation level, how sometimes our need to belong and to be together or to be with people like us has worked against us, how separate communities have come into conflict with each other, how communities themselves have often struggled internally to have peace and harmony among their individual members. how even positive forms of community, like a democracy, for example, have their shortcomings and are vulnerable to corruption. Wright says, quote, "Thus, from the most intimate relationship, marriage, to those on the largest scale, national institutions, we find the same thing. We all know we are made to live together, but we all find that doing so is more difficult than we imagined." This is all true, and pretty much exactly what we would expect from animals such as we are, sometimes selfish, sometimes foolish, with limited knowledge and with an imperfect ability to accurately foresee the consequences of our actions. There is no God necessary to account for any of this or to give it any sort of special meaning. Next, Wright turns to the subject of sex, because really, hasn't history shown religious clerics to be the greatest source of wisdom and understanding about sex? Anyway, he isn't talking about sex just in the romantic or erotic sense, thankfully. He's also talking in terms of sexual roles and gender types. He says, quote, "Recent generations in the West have seen huge efforts expended on the attempt to teach boys and girls that the differences between them are simply a matter of biological function. We have been sternly warned against stereotyping people according to their gender, and yet today's parents, however impeccable their idealistic credentials, have discovered most little boys like playing with toy guns and cars, and that a remarkable number of little girls like playing with dolls, dressing them up, and nursing them." Well, I think Wright has misunderstood the modern attitude about gender roles that he is attempting to criticize. The point isn't to stop boys who want to play with cars from playing with cars, or to stop girls who want to play with dolls from playing with dolls. The point is not to force a person into a particular gender role just because of his or her biological sex. If your little boy loves playing with trucks, fine. If your little boy loves playing with dolls, also fine. That's the point. It's not about destroying these distinctions between males and females. It's not about teaching children that men and women are identical and interchangeable, that there aren't important differences between the sexes, which is something that Wright charges a few lines down from that bit I just quoted. It's about allowing people to figure out for themselves who they are, where they are comfortable, and then respecting and supporting that, whether it conforms with traditional expectations about gender roles or not. By the way, I'm not sure what that digression had to do with, specifically with Christianity. I'm grateful that he's writing about things that haven't been covered in the other apologetics books that I've reviewed, but it does seem a little odd that he would, start talking about sex and gender roles and sort of, shake his finger at modern, more open, tolerant views of children living outside of their traditional gender roles in the middle of a book about Christianity. Wright argues that when we relate to each other through extreme forms of sexuality, which he defines as either trying to live as neuters and pretending that our sexuality doesn't matter at all, or by viewing other people as nothing more than potential sex partners on the other end of the scale, we are distorting reality. Wright argues that we are gendered beings, and it makes no sense to deny this fact. But on the other hand, viewing each other in purely sexual terms and treating our sexual relationships too casually is to embrace living death. Yes, that's a quote, by the way. Wright actually uses the phrase, embrace living death. Casual sex is dehumanizing to human relationships and amounts to embracing a living death. What did I tell you about religious clerics and their sex wisdom, right? Wright's main point is that sex is very important to people. Also important to people, death. He links sex and death together, writing that death causes us to question our desire for relationships. Why do we long for relationships with each other when we know that even the happiest of these relationships must eventually, inevitably, end in death? Well, Wright explains our longing for relationships, even though we know that they must be impermanent, in the context of the creation story of the book of Genesis. He says that humans were made in God's image for the purpose, Wright says, of looking after God's creation and developing it to fulfill God's purpose. And Wright compares this to ancient rulers placing statues of themselves in the distant provinces of their empires to remind the people there who was in charge. Wright says, quote, "This has, to us, a threatening sound. We are Democrats, after all. We don't want far-off rulers giving us orders, still less, as we rightly suspect, demanding our money. But that only shows how much our relationships with God, with the world, and with one another have been flawed and corrupted." I don't know about that. A far-off ruler asserting authority and control over us and demanding our money? That sounds exactly like the God of the Bible to me. So we yearn for these relationships even though we know they're impermanent, because we're made in that image of God, and God also yearns for relationships with us. So that's basically where he's going with that. And Wright says that our failure to form perfect relationships with each other is a result of our failure to form a relationship with God, just the same as our inability to form a perfectly just society or maintain a perfectly fulfilling spirituality also result from our separation from God. Wright says, quote, "One of the central elements of the Christian story is the claim that the paradox of laughter and tears, woven as it is deep into the heart of all human experience, is woven also deep into the heart of God." Well, that would certainly explain why God is the direct cause of so much death and destruction and fear and suffering in the Old Testament particularly. It's probably, as I've long suspected, God's just a sick, sexually frustrated bully who likes to jerk off to us while we cry. Moving on to chapter 4, which is titled "For the Beauty of the Earth," an appropriate title given that the analysis of this chapter follows right on a particularly beautiful God masturbating joke, if I may say so myself. Wright begins the chapter by comparing our perception of the beauty of the world to a hypothetical discovery of a piece of music, of a piano part of a never-before-heard composition for multiple instruments by Mozart. We imagine that someone has discovered this sheet music, and it's just the piano part to this never-before-heard Mozart piece. And you can play the piano music, and you can hear it, and you recognize that it's Mozart, but you can't hear the music of the other instruments. So you have this tantalizing piece, this fragment of what you can imagine is a beautiful, stunning piece of music, but it's also frustrating because you only have just one tiny piece of it, and you can't glimpse the whole. That's what our perception of beauty in the world is like, Wright says. It's awesome and it's beautiful and it moves us, but it also feels incomplete, according to him. He says, quote, "Beauty, in other words, is another echo of a voice which, from the evidence before us, might be saying one of several different things, but which, were we to hear it in all its fullness, would make sense of what we presently see and hear and know and call and love and call beautiful." Now, I am not about to argue that beauty isn't a complicated and fascinating part of how we perceive the world, but I do find what Wright is doing here somewhat paradoxical in trying to make beauty seem complex by describing it as part of this larger, divinely connected whole. He's actually simplifying it quite a bit. As he described justice in the first chapter, Wright is treating beauty as if it were one thing, as if it were an objective thing that just existed in the world, that we all just sort of perceived in different ways. But personal concepts of beauty differ, in some cases, vastly from one person to another, just as personal ideas about justice do. And in fact, our ideas about beauty may differ from each other even more than our ideas about justice differ. What is stunningly beautiful to me might not warrant a second look from you. Ultimately, it's a matter of opinion. That's what our perception of beauty is. And it's an opinion that is composed and sort of created using a lot of very interesting, complex factors. It's no simple thing forming an opinion on beauty, but it is still an opinion nonetheless. I can find something beautiful. You can find the same thing hideous or boring or whatever, and neither of us is right or wrong because there's no such thing as objective beauty. Wright describes the transience of beauty. He talks of how we photograph a sunset, but that actual moment itself can't be held on to. The sunset itself is gone. We can listen to recordings of symphonies, but the live performances of the symphony are all unique and they're impossible to fully capture. You'll never get everything from a recording that you'll get from actually being there and hearing them play that music in the moment. We can gaze at the stunning view from the top of a mountain, and we can build a house there, Wright says, and look at that view every day for the rest of our lives, and we still can't imagine being completely fulfilled by it or getting enough of it. We'll always want to see it more. What Wright is actually describing in these passages, I think, is the transience of existence in general, not just of beauty. And I agree with what he seems to be saying here, which kind of contradicts some things that other apologists have written, and for all I know may contradict things that Wright himself is about to say later in the book. I don't know. He seems to be saying that the fleeting nature of our experiences is that thing that gives them value, that it's bittersweet, that the moments that we experience are precious to us precisely because they don't linger and can't ever be retrieved. But I don't think that it's nearly as mysterious or as demanding of a mystical explanation as Wright is making it out to be. Wright acknowledges the role of our personal preferences in our perceptions of beauty. He paraphrases Oscar Wilde, who once described a cigarette as being exquisite yet leaving you unsatisfied. And then Wright observes how few people today would agree with such a statement being made about a cigarette. Wright says, quote, "But tastes and fashions change in beauty as in many other things. They change so thoroughly that we are forced to ask whether beauty is, after all, simply in the eye of the beholder, or whether we can give any more satisfactory account of it which will leave us in possession of one part at least of the complete whole." Well, if beauty is in the eye of the beholder, then the complete whole Wright is referring to isn't there at all. It's just something that Wright is making up. Just as our standards of what makes a beautiful person change over time, so do our ideas of what constitutes beauty in nature. Wright notes that despite how today most of us consider scenes of mountains or forests to be valuable for their beauty, people in earlier centuries viewed such places with fear and as sources of danger. Wright asks how fashions can change so easily, especially for things like this, like the natural world, which doesn't really change itself all that much from our perspective. Well, I wouldn't say fashions do change easily. I mean, in some cases they do. There are new clothing fashions every year and things like this, and there are always fads that come and go. But things like what a particular society considers to be beautiful, they don't tend to change so easily. They do change, but they change gradually over time as years go by, as new generations of people are born and come of age and old generations die off, as circumstances in society change, as all sorts of factors continue to shift and evolve. It's not usually the sort of thing that changes abruptly and suddenly and forever like that. In the case of mountains and forests, for example, since Wright brought that up, I think it's fair to say that we find places like these beautiful today in ways that our ancestors in centuries past didn't, because we live in a time when these places have been studied and explored and are understood, and when most of us don't feel at their mercy. Mountains and endless square miles of wilderness aren't obstacles to most of us today anymore. They aren't places that we have to go. They aren't dangers that we have to face. They're places that we choose to go, and where many people have gone before us and demonstrated that there isn't as much there to fear as we thought, and that we can appreciate them for their natural qualities, for their aesthetic qualities, for their beauty. That to me is the explanation for that particular change. Again, Wright is working very hard here to conjure a mystery where one doesn't exist, so that he can then suggest a solution that isn't actually necessary. Wright quotes Keats, who wrote, "Beauty is truth, truth beauty." Wright says, quote, "If beauty and truth are one and the same, then truth is different for everyone, for every age, and indeed for the same person from year to year. If beauty were hidden in the beholder's eye, then truth would be merely a way of talking about the inner feelings that went along with it. And that simply isn't how we normally use the word truth." Well, as with the digression about gender roles, it kind of feels like Wright is trying to just sort of up his word count here. It depends on the context, doesn't it, of how we're using the word truth. If we're talking about factual truth, then no, we aren't talking about inner feelings about something. But if we're talking about truth in the Keatsian sense, as more of a poetical or philosophical concept, then we could very well say that we are talking about feelings rather than something in an objective reality. And this is the trouble with trying to translate the poetic into the literal. Keats was expressing his own feelings and ideas using poetry. He wasn't handing down a binding ruling on the nature of truth and beauty. Wright insists that we cannot conclude that our awareness of beauty and truth leads us directly to God. That is not what he's saying. God, like beauty, is more elusive than that. Rather, beauty, like justice, spirituality, and our need for relationships, only points towards something greater than ourselves. It doesn't definitively tell us God is there. It's a signpost, Wright says. Wright references Plato and Plato's theory of forms, the concept that the world we see is only a shadow of a higher, more ideal, perfect world. Wright says, quote, "This means that everything in our world is indeed a pointer to something in a world beyond, a world which we can learn to contemplate and even to love for its own sake. If we don't make this transition, if we simply accept natural and man-made beauty on its own terms, we mustn't be surprised if it seems on closer inspection to collapse into our own subjective feelings." I have no problems accepting the natural world on these terms. In fact, I feel like I do accept the natural world on those terms, and I find that it doesn't collapse on closer inspection, but it actually grows even more beautiful with every new truth that we learn about it. Of course, that's just me. Some of you might reckon beauty differently, and that wouldn't surprise me or bother me at all. The problem with Plato's forms for Wright is that it disagrees with the Abrahamic faiths. Wright says, quote, "It's all very well to say that beauty in this present world is puzzling, transient, and sometimes apparently only skin deep, while underneath is all worms and rottenness. But if we push that just an inch further, we find ourselves saying that the present world of space, time, and matter is bad in itself. And this is deeply untrue to the great traditions of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. The great monotheistic faiths declare in full view of the apparently contrary evidence that the present world of space, time, and matter always was and still is the good creation of a good God." I could be reading it wrong. I don't feel like those lines are particularly addressed to me as an atheist, as a skeptic. I think that's Wright doing something good, actually, and challenging the attitudes of many Christians who tend to have a very pessimistic view of the world. Now, I could be giving him too much credit on that, but that's the way I read it. But what he said isn't entirely perfect. I have to ask, can we just accept that beauty is a feature of how we experience the present world without also declaring that it's all worms and rottenness underneath? Can't we just accept it for what it is and appreciate it for its own qualities, for its own sake, without either assuming that it calls us to something greater or that it's just a bunch of shit underneath everything? Why is that not an option? Wright says, quote, "Heaven and earth are full of glory, a glory which stubbornly refuses to be reduced to terms of the senses of the humans who perceive it." Okay, but isn't this a reminder of the limitations of our human senses? How is our awe when faced with the glory of the universe evidence of anything other than our imperfectly evolved capacity to comprehend it? And whose glory is it, Wright asks, with which the heaven and the earth are filled? Well, of course, he's saying that it's God's glory. Wright describes how the Bible, both Old and New Testament, promises that the beauty of this world will one day become one with the beauty of God, and that will complete that piece of music, so to speak, of which we only have the one part. God will not only restore the world, he will complete the world. As he writes about the complexity of the world and of ourselves, Wright says, what may be the truest thing that I've yet read in an apologetics book, and it's this, quote, "We should expect the world and our relation to it to be at least as complex as we are. If there is a God, we should expect such a being to be at least as complex again." I could not agree more, but this book isn't about pondering whether or not there is a God. This book argues that there is a God and goes on to describe the nature of this God and the expectations that this God has for us. So I ask again, and certainly not for the last time, where is the evidence to substantiate any of this? Wright says that we do 5 basic things as we live our very complex lives, although occasionally he says our lives are very simple. We do 5 things. We tell stories, we act out rituals, we create beauty, we work in communities, and we think out beliefs. We all need to do each of these things to varying degrees, Wright says, and if we find ourselves unable to do one of them for whatever reason, we feel that our lives and our quality of life has been diminished. Christianity, Wright says, means to satisfy all 5 of these basic elements of life, as well as to provide access to truth, which Wright acknowledges is also a complex and multifaceted concept. Knowing, like truth, is also a complex concept. How can you say that you know something, etc.? These are all these inescapable philosophical questions that we all have to deal with, and Wright acknowledges this to his credit. Wright suggests that to know a deep truth is to become involved with it as you would become involved with a person in a relationship, so that your knowing of it becomes both subjective and objective. There is an objective truth, there's a thing that the truth is referring to, but you become sort of immersed in it, you become entangled with it. Wright says that one word for this kind of deep knowing is love. But before we can go there, we must learn more about the God of Christianity, which Wright claims can make sense of those 4 echoes of the voice that he's discussed in these first 4 chapters. Again, the longings for justice, spirituality, relationships, and beauty. And in the chapters that follow, Wright will begin to describe and discuss this God of Christianity that he believes to be the key to this whole thing. So that's the end of chapter 4 and the end of part 1 of the book. Before I wrap up, I just want to say that I appreciate that Wright sees his faith and his God as something satisfying and encouraging, and something that compels him to take what he feels to be positive action in the world. I applaud Christians, I applaud members of any other religion who take from their faiths a motivation to treat people with fairness and kindness, or to derive deep meaning from their own lives, or to reach out to other people and form relationships, or to see beauty in the world. I think that is wonderful. And I would hope that every religious person got something like that from their faith, although unfortunately I don't think that is the case. But that doesn't mean what Wright has done in these first 4 chapters is reasonable or intellectually honest. It's one thing to observe that humans have a tendency to be attracted to concepts like justice and spirituality and relationships and beauty, and to say that your faith satisfies you regarding these matters. It's quite another to claim that the mere presence of these longings in most people is evidence, however indirect and insufficient, for the existence of any God. You can't say, you can't suggest, you can't imply, as Wright has done, well, we yearn for something greater than ourselves, therefore that greater something must be there. You cannot do that. You need evidence for that greater something, and there isn't any. There isn't a single piece of evidence suggesting that a God exists or telling us anything about that God. N.T. Wright has not allowed that to stop him. However, in the next video in the series, I'll start part 2 of the book, which is titled Staring at the Sun, in which I expect Wright will tell us all about God. So, in the next video, I'll be covering chapter 5, which is titled God, kind of a giveaway there, and chapter 6, which is titled Israel. So that'll be fun. That's the end of part 1. That's the end of, we're a quarter of the way done, this 8-episode series. So look on the bright side there, will you? Thank you guys so much for watching. As always, please feel free to comment on anything you've heard me say here. Tell me I'm right, tell me I'm wrong, tell me I'm an idiot, tell me I'm a genius, tell me anything you want to tell me. I look forward to reading your comments and having a conversation with you and hearing what you have to say. I'm so happy that you're watching. I'm so glad that this is of use to so many of you. Thank you so much, and I'll see you next time.